you've never done it before and you're just not confident, this is one of those recipes that's really easy. Oftentimes I get distracted with something else going on, and so having a recipe like this to kind of keep me in check of what I'm doing, to make sure I'm doing it right, it's really helpful. And even then I get it wrong. It's okay. You do not need a water bath canner to can. You can do that little test, or you can throw it across the room like I accidentally did a little bit ago. Hey there, my name is Crystal. Welcome. I'm in my kitchen today. In this video, I'm going to be canning up jalapenos that we've grown in our garden this year. Pickled jalapenos is one of my most favorite things, and I didn't do it last year because I was pregnant and I could not stand the smell of the vinegar, garlic, brine. It wasn't good, so it was just not happening. But I'm finally gonna have them back in the pantry and I'm really excited about it. This is one of the most easiest recipes to water bath can outside of canning whole tomatoes, which I do have another video on. I will link it down below if you're interested in it. If you're new to water bath canning, you've never done it before and you're just not confident, this is one of those recipes that's really easy, especially if you like pickled jalapenos. So the recipe that I'm using is the pickled hot peppers recipe in the Ball Complete book of home preserving, and mine is falling apart. The pages are literally falling out. I'm using other pages as markers for the pages that I want. It's page 316 and it's the pickled hot peppers recipe, and it's super easy. The recipe calls for banana peppers, jalapenos, and serrano peppers. I'm just going to be using the jalapenos. I'm not going to be adding anything else because that's what I want. With these recipes, you can make little tweaks here and there and you should be fine, but you want to stick with anything that has to do with processing times, headspace, or acidity levels. That's what you want to keep an eye on when doing these recipes. And I just like using them as a guide. I have a lot of things going on in our house, and oftentimes I get distracted with something else going on, and so having a recipe like this to kind of keep me in check of what I'm doing, to make sure I'm doing it right, it's really helpful. And even then I get it wrong. It's okay, it happens. The recipe says it makes about 5 pint jars. I'm going to be using half pint jars, jelly jars. I find that this size is the perfect size. If I'm making like a big tray of nachos or something, I just drain this size can and it sprinkles over the top of the nachos perfectly. If I'm using it for burgers and might not need the whole jar, then I have these reusable lids that Ball makes. They sell them at Walmart. I just put that top on and stick it in the fridge, or I just put the band back on with the lid, and that works just as fine. If you're new to my videos, I will have all of the timestamps down in the description, and if there's a particular spot that you're looking for, you just click whatever it is that you want and it will bring you right to that point. You don't have to watch or skip through the whole video until you find what you need. We're here to help. The other thing that I will have in the description is the Amazon links to some of the things that I am using. So like the canning funnel or ladle. Some of the stuff I didn't necessarily get on Amazon, but I'll try and find it on there. You know, the prices on Amazon might not be the greatest, so shop around. I know Walmart and Target sometimes have really good deals on canning stuff, and so does Tractor Supply carries canning stuff also. I'm gonna quickly list the supplies and the ingredients that I'm using to can up the jalapenos. I have about a dozen half pint jars, a box of regular mouth lids, and then about 12 or so bands that go around them, a pickle packer, canning funnel, ladle, bubble tool,
jar grippers,
lint-free rag, a pot to make the brine in, a water bath canner, or a large stock pot with a lid. You do not need a water bath canner to can. You can use a large stock pot with a lid. You don't need a water bath canner. You do need a rack for the bottom, or rolled up tin foil, just something to prevent the jars from sitting directly on the bottom of the stock pot. I know there's other channels out there that have talked about how to make a foil rack for the bottom of your stock pot. I've never done it before, so just search for it. I'm sure you'll find it if you don't have a water bath canner with a rack. I have Pickle Crisp. This is an optional thing. I'm adding Pickle Crisp. It keeps peppers and cucumbers and things from getting mushy during the canning process, and I found that it does work, so I will be adding Pickle Crisp to each one of the jars. Distilled white vinegar, filtered tap water, garlic, and of course jalapenos. We've had a really great pepper year here. We live in Connecticut. The hot, humid weather early on really has led to super prolific pepper plants. They grew early this year and they just keep producing, and we've had just a wonderful pepper year. All right, so with all of that, let's get into the nitty gritty. The first thing I like to do is wash the peppers really well. I have this new wash basin here that I'm not only able to harvest in, but I can let the peppers or cucumbers or whatever we harvest sit in the water and get a good bath. There's also a drain at the bottom. It's easy to carry around and it's come in real handy so far this gardening season. After washing the peppers really well, I get some gloves. If you've ever worked with spicy peppers before, you know that the oils can stay on your fingers, and if you touch your eye, it's really awful. We also have a baby and little kids, and we don't want anything that can burn them on our fingers. I start with cutting up the jalapenos. As I cut them up, I put them in a bowl with a lid so I can store them for a bit until I'm ready to can them up later. And as for the stems, I put those in a bowl for the compost. With a sharp knife, I remove the stem side and then cut rings as evenly as I am able to. They are maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe bigger. It's important to remember that when you're canning food for you and your family, to customize whatever it is to how you like to eat it or whatever recipes you like to add it to. For example, candied jalapenos, we prefer the jalapenos to be diced like a relish. It's so good to add as a condiment to burgers, but also good to mix in with dips and things like that. And having it diced is easier to mix it in. For pickled jalapenos, we prefer rings. They are usually used as a topping and not really an ingredient in anything, either on nachos, burgers, sandwiches, and salads. After I cut them all up, I stored those for a couple hours until I was able to start the brine and preheat the canner. The canner is a large stock pot and can take some time to bring the water up to a boil, so getting it started while doing other things limits the wait times. To the other pot, I added 6 cups of distilled white vinegar, 2 cups of water. Then I added maybe a clove or 2 of sliced garlic that I had already made up because I was also canning pickles today. I brought that up to a boil, and once it was boiling, I covered it and let it boil for about 5 minutes. After that, I removed it from the heat and let it cool slightly while I packed the jars. To each jar, I added the jalapenos, and every so often I would smash them down with this pickle packer that I got as a gift a few years ago. It makes it so much easier to fill the jars. I'm packing them down, trying to remember to leave 1/2 inch of headspace. The headspace is the distance between the contents of the jar and the rim. If you overfill a jar, it can cause the lids not to seal or siphoning. It's just not worth it after all the work you're doing. So read the recipe and remember to leave the proper headspace. It will vary depending on the type of food that you are canning. Of course, it's me in the kitchen, and it's a super messy process. I had seeds everywhere. I had to clean them up. My dog, Rocky, was waiting there like he was going to be licking up all these jalapeno seeds, which would have been a nightmare in itself. So I had to clean it up as best as I could and vacuum up all the seeds. Next, I'm adding the pickle crisp to each of the jars. For pint jars, it's 1/8 of a teaspoon of pickle crisp, and 1/16 of a teaspoon for half pint jars. I use pickle crisp when I can pickles or peppers or anything that can get mushy during the canning process. To these jars, I added 1/16 of a teaspoon. Then I washed the lids using some warm water and dish soap. You do not need to boil lids anymore. I'm using regular mouth lids because the jars are regular mouth. Brine has 2 different size mouths or openings on their jars. One is regular mouth and the other is wide mouth. I prefer wide mouth usually for things that need to be packed, like pickles, whole tomatoes, because it's easier to get the things into the jar, and it's also easier to get them out of the jar when we're eating them. But with the jelly jars, there's no shoulders on it, making it easy to pack the pepper rings. Putting the canning funnel onto the jar and then using the ladle, I pour the brine over the top of the peppers, remembering to leave a 1/2 inch of head space. Using a bubble tool, I remove the bubbles from the jar. If I need to add liquid, I do so, but make sure to get rid of all the bubbles again after, and then measure headspace again. And you keep repeating that process until the jar is how you want it. So once all the jars are full, the way that they should be, you want to make sure to remove any excess that might be on the rim of the jar. It could be a seed or brine, anything on the rim that can prevent the lid from sealing. So to make sure that the rim is clean, I take a lint-free rag or either a t-shirt or flour sack towel. I put some distilled white vinegar on it and I go around each jar rim. Once this is done, I can add each lid to the jar. I don't worry about drying them off. I just shake off some of the excess water and place them on the jar. Then I take a band and tighten it finger tight. Finger tight means using the tips of your fingers and tightening the band down. Do not crank on the band and don't leave it too loose either. Just do finger tight so that the band is securely holding the lid in place. Once all the lids and bands are on, I move the jars right up next to the canner to warm up a bit. I usually preheat the jars for sauces, salsa, tomatoes, or when I'm pressure canning anything. I make sure that the jars are preheated. You technically should do that here too. I take a slight risk and don't fully because I don't want to overprocess the peppers or cucumbers when I'm making pickles. You want to avoid drastic temperature changes with these jars as much as possible. So going from cold to hot can cause the glass to break or vice versa. So oftentimes you will see in recipes to let the jars sit and come up or down from temperature to avoid the jars from breaking. After a little bit, I added the jars to the canning rack inside the canner. Then I slowly put them down under the water. You need about 1 inch of water over the tops of the jars. I like to use the bubble tool to check for this. It's okay to have more than 1 inch, but you want at least 1 inch. I put the lid back on the Waterbath Canner and wait for the water to be at a rolling boil. A rolling boil is when the water is bubbling constantly and you can't stir the bubbles out. Once that happens, I set the timer for 10 minutes. After the 10 minutes is up, I turn the burner off, remove the lid of the canner away from my face because that steam is brutal and it's dangerous. So make sure you open the lid away from your face. Now I let the jar sit there for about 5 minutes before lifting the rack out of the water. Again, this slowly brings the jars back to a cooler temperature. If I were to immediately take the jars out, the cooler air alone can cause them to break. So we let them sit in there for at least 5 minutes. I try and keep it close to that time because, again, I don't want the peppers to sit in hot water longer than they need to. After that, I lift the rack up. I put a folded towel down on the counter and one by one start moving the jars to the towel. Okay, and that's it. We canned up some jalapenos. I'm really happy with how they turned out. This is how they look. They will sit on the counter for at least a day. And I'm gonna put a label on here with the date. I have these water soluble labels. You can write on here. It's easier to write on the labels than it is on the jars sometimes. I will remove the bands and make sure that the seal on the lids are good. You can do that little test, or you can throw it across the room like I accidentally did a little bit ago. I'm joking, do not throw it across the room. You also want to check and make sure that the little thingy, the popping part, is pushed down. Okay, if you're pressing on it and it's making a clicking sound didn't seal good. And that's it. After I label them, I will store them in my pantry like this without the band, and keeping the band off is just to prevent any kind of false sealing, create the illusion that it sealed when it actually didn't. So by removing the band, it's easier to tell if the seal is good or not. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this. And I think that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time. Bye!